The silence of the private hospital room was broken only by the steady hum of the machines and the faint rhythmic beeping of the monitor beside the bed. The curtains were half drawn, allowing a sliver of afternoon light to cut across the polished floor tiles. In the middle of that sterile calm lay Adrian Cross, a man whose name graced the covers of financial magazines, a man who had built empires with his cunning mind and relentless drive, yet now appeared helpless, motionless, as though trapped in a prison of his own body. His chest rose and fell slowly, and his eyes were closed, his face as serene as though he were deeply asleep. To anyone watching, Adrian was in a coma. But behind those closed eyelids, his mind was wide awake, alert, and calculating every sound that echoed in the room. Adrian had chosen this charade. For weeks now, he had allowed the world, including his business rivals, the media, and even some members of his family, to believe that he had fallen into a coma after a sudden collapse. The doctors thought they were observing a fragile recovery. The nurses treated him with professional care. But only Adrian knew the truth, that this elaborate deception was part of his plan. He wanted to see what people would say when they thought he couldn't hear. He wanted to uncover the loyalties that were true and the betrayals that were hidden. Money had taught him one cruel lesson: the more wealth you held, the harder it was to know who genuinely cared for you and who only craved the glittering crumbs of your fortune. For days, he had listened to footsteps entering and leaving his room. Relatives who whispered impatiently about inheritance. Business partners who spoke in low voices about next moves in the event of his demise. Old friends who sighed about his brilliance but left quickly, as if their loyalty expired with his usefulness. Adrian heard it all. And every word sank like lead into his heart. But what he had not expected was the voice of one particular nurse, a young woman assigned to his care, whose presence had begun to disturb his carefully constructed mask of indifference. Her name was Elena. She was unlike the others, her step softer, her voice warmer. Where others treated him as an object of duty, she lingered a little longer, straightening his sheets with unnecessary gentleness, adjusting the drip with eyes that seemed to carry unspoken thoughts. Adrian would have dismissed her as another passing figure in his play, but one night, when the hospital was quiet and shadows filled the corners of the room, Elena's voice broke through the silence, and with it, she shattered the walls around Adrian's carefully hidden heart. She had spoken when she thought no one was listening. Her confession slipped out like a secret she could no longer contain. "You don't know me," she whispered softly, her voice trembling as though afraid of the darkness itself, "and maybe you'll never hear me. But taking care of you has become the strangest, most unexpected part of my life. I used to hate wealthy men who thought they could buy everything. My father worked himself to death because of one like you. But here you are, lying helpless, and I can't stop myself from feeling sorry for you. And worse, I can't stop myself from caring. I don't even understand why." Adrian's pulse quickened, though he was careful not to let it show. He had been prepared to hear greed, resentment, even pity. But what he heard instead was honesty so raw it left him shaken. A woman who despised what he represented, yet could not keep her heart from softening toward him. He wanted to open his eyes, to tell her he was listening, to ask her why, but his plan held him back. His disguise had to remain intact. And so he lay still, silent, while inside his mind the storm began to gather. As the days passed, Elena's presence grew like an anchor in the drifting sea of Adrian's deception. She spoke more often, sometimes about her life, her struggles as the daughter of a man crushed by corporate greed, her determination to become a nurse despite the debts that chained her family. Sometimes she spoke about him, wondering aloud if he could hear, telling him about the flowers she placed on his bedside table, hoping he might like them. Each word dug into Adrian's chest, pulling at emotions he thought had long been buried beneath his armor of wealth and cynicism. Meanwhile, outside the sterile safety of the hospital walls, Adrian's empire was trembling. Competitors circled like vultures, waiting for official confirmation of his decline. His half-brother, Marcus, had already begun to whisper among the board members, hinting that Adrian's coma might last forever and that leadership needed to shift. Lawyers prowled, family members argued over shares and estates. The world believed Adrian was fading, but the man himself was wide awake, planning to rise when the time was right and strike back at every betrayer. What he had not planned for was the effect Elena's words would have on him. Every evening, when the hospital halls grew quiet and only the hum of the machines kept him company, Adrian waited. He waited for the sound of her shoes approaching, the rustle of her uniform, the scent of lavender soap that always clung faintly to her presence. She had become his only thread to humanity, the only voice that reminded him he was still more than a machine of ambition. And then came the night when her confession deepened, tearing through the last of his defenses. She sat at his bedside, her hand brushing lightly against his as though testing the universe itself, and she whispered, "If you could hear me, I'd probably lose my job. But sometimes I wish you'd wake up. Just so I could tell you that even though you're supposed to be just another patient, I feel something I shouldn't. I don't know if it's pity, or compassion, or something far more dangerous. But I've started to wonder if maybe behind all that money and power, there's a man who's been lonely all along." Adrian felt his throat tighten, a surge of emotion he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. He wanted to shout, to grab her hand, to break the illusion and tell her she was right. But he remained still. Because now, this was no longer just about exposing betrayal. This was about discovering the one soul brave enough to love him for who he truly was, not for the empire he commanded. And as Elena sat there, unaware that every syllable of her confession was carving itself into Adrian's soul, he made a silent vow: when the time came for him to awaken, it would not only be to reclaim his throne, it would be to confront the woman whose honesty had undone him. But he also knew the moment he revealed the truth, he might lose her forever.